Does it echo too much? All right, go ahead and get settled. I don't mean to destroy conversation. We're in the process of getting going. It'll take a couple more minutes to get a few things lined up. A few sort of points of order for those who are in there who are new to the space. First, welcome to Social Networks and Health 2025. We really appreciate you having here. This is, believe it or not, year 10 of this workshop, maybe year 11, depending on how you count that first sort of thing. And I'm so pleased to have people here and returning who had been here for all those years, and a good chance to sort of just see what this community is. It's just really remarkable. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to open the fire hose, and the rest of this week you've got to try to drink from it. So that's basically the theme of how this is going to work. And so what we hope happens is that you have some great ideas and so forth. And this is, and the way our cycle works is we do a beginner's workshop and then an advanced workshop every other year. And this is the advanced workshop. So what that means really is that we kind of assume you know the basics of networks. My job is to make sure that we speak the same language. So what's going to happen today is you're going to get all of the beginner's training, most of it, in about an hour and a half. So it's going to be a lot. But the whole goal is to get us moving. And I'll describe a little bit some strategies for how to simplify that. Some housekeeping things. If you parked, you need a parking pass. If you didn't get the parking pass, I'm not exactly sure how you parked, but because I don't know how you got in the lot. But if you did, that pass needs to be displayed on the dash of your car. If it is not displayed on the dash of your car, they will ticket you. I guess they think you like snuck under the bar or something. So make sure you do that. If you didn't print out your parking pass, we have printed parking passes in the back. Madeline has them, and she can share them with you. There is food that will be around. So it'll be back at the table. We do this. We'll have lunch served. We do a lunch sort of discussion and workshop as we move forward. It's all informal. We're a little low budget this year for various and sundry reasons, and so write your own name on your name tag. I see most of you have found out how to do that already. And the main thing is get to know your neighbors and get to say hello and so forth. What am I missing on basic sort of organizational things? I just sent around a Google Drive link to your email. We will ask most of the presenters to put their presentations up here, and you'll have access to them. You'll also have access to supplementary papers and code that people give and so forth. What else to talk about in terms of those kinds of mechanics? There is a Slack channel that we're trying to get started, and a few of you have links to that. Feel free to jump into that as you want, and we can move with that. Other sort of organizational things like that, Madeline, that we need? Great. This workshop would not be possible. I'm so loud. Is that a little better? This workshop would not be possible without the support of the National Institute of Health, our 25 program. So we acknowledge their support and are very grateful for it. So now you can't hear me at all. There we go. On and off. Is that too much again? Can you hear me there again? Can you hear me at all and again? Okay. All right, thanks. So we acknowledge the R25 Social Networks and Health. They've funded this workshop and made it possible. We're exceedingly grateful to them. If you find this workshop useful and helpful, we will give you the name of our program officer, and you should email them and tell them how wonderful we are. If you find it lacking, we're funded by the National Science Foundation. So just keep that in mind. There are a few fun things. So it's a largely free schedule in the evenings, except for Wednesday night. There will be a pizza party downstairs. So it says pizza and beer on the deck of the Gross Hall here. If it's absolutely pouring rain, we might try to convince the people in the Nicholas School to let us use their atrium downstairs. But otherwise, hopefully it'll be a firefly evening on the deck. If you haven't RSVP'd for that, please do. Because we're going to order the pizzas this afternoon, so I need to know how many to put in the order and how many cases of beer to buy. So other than that, I think we'll get started. Questions or thoughts or any major problems that we can deal with right now? Big thank to Madeline Wellens in the back. you've all gotten emails from Madeline. She has sort of kept this sort of program running, and all the things that need to have happen. It's probably Madeline's, as a result of Madeline's work. Mistakes are by my poor organization. Otherwise, we will try to start most days at 9, or as close to that as we can. The food will arrive about 8:30, so today's a little bit just discombobulated. We are guests at IID, which is the Information Initiative at Duke. They're the people with all the fancy sort of stuff out here in the hallway. Please do use this door if you can to come and go, because there are graduate students and postdocs working like literally right through those garage doors from us, so it'd be nice to make sure that we don't disturb them too much. We don't bite, so there are chairs in front if people want them, and we can get more chairs if we need them. So we are a little bit want for plugins, so if you find that your laptop is starting to discharge, please be nice to the people whose laptop is charged and trade with them, right? So part of what we're doing here is creating networks, and the way you create networks that we learned almost nothing from Watts, but if we learned something from Watts, is that random ties connect across divisions. So if you find someone next to you who has a laptop charging and yours is not, say, hey, nice to meet you. My name is Jim. Let's trade seats so I can plug into your laptop, okay? All right. Other questions, thoughts, comments, concerns? All right, let's get started then. So if you're here, you care about networks. And networks are the thing that ties the world together. And I've started with this quote in almost every presentation I've ever given up to now. And it says, to speak of social life, you speak of the association between people. They're associating in work and in play, in love and in war, to trade or to worship, to help or to hinder. It is in the social relations been established that their interests find expressions and their desires become realized. What Peter Plough is saying is that networks are the thing that make us persons. It's the thing that creates, it's the strong program in social network analysis, that what we are as human critters, other than our biology, is the thing that connects us to each other. And it's those social relations that allow us to become whos as opposed to whats. A person is a father, a husband, a brother. A what is a human that has 2 legs and balding hair, right? These are different things. And what it means to be social is to have these kinds of connections. And what social network analysis is designed to do is to help us understand and codify those relations so that we can make scientific sense of them. And this was the insight that Jacob Moreno had. Jacob Moreno argued that if we ever get to the point of charting a whole city or a whole nation, we would have a picture of a vast solar system of intangible structures powerfully influencing conduct as gravitation does in space. That's the promise of network analysis, that there are these invisible threads connecting us throughout the world, and they're systematic, they're natural, they're regular, they're understandable. And if we understand them, we could predict the orbits of humans in the same way that we could predict the orbits of the planets. Now, as it turns out, that might have been a little grand, right? As it turns out, people are a little more complicated than gravity. One equation ain't going to do it, but maybe 6, maybe 10, we're getting there, right? And so the goal is to figure out what pieces we can understand, how we can't, and how to drive those in a way that can help us build insights. To give a little example of what networks are for those who are really new in the world, right? We think of high schools. We think of buildings and curricula and so forth. When social network researchers think of high schools, this is a high school. When I think of a high school, this is what I think of. It's a collection of points and lines. Each point is a person. Each line is a relation between them. They're arrayed on the screen, in this case, by what's called a force attractor layout algorithm. So nodes that are next to each other tend to be friends with each other. Nodes that are far apart tend not to be friends with each other. And so the clustering you see in these kinds of graphs are a reflection of the underlying social structure that's active there, of the pattern of relations. It's not a reflection of my choice, really. It's generated by the data. It's an emergent property. And because it's a high school, in this case, it makes a lot of sense, right? You get the junior high up here and 7th and 8th graders. You get the high school down here. They live in separate buildings, and so the relations between them are sparse. And you can see some within-group ordering. So you get the freshmen sort of near to the junior high, and you get the seniors sort of as far away from the freshmen as they can get. And so this is a sensible pattern. But in this particular pattern, there's another feature which is going on, which is this internal structure of this network is divided by race. There's a group of white kids and a group of black kids, and rarely the twain shall meet. And what's fascinating in this particular structure is that the division between the high school or the white kids and the black kids is as large as the difference between the junior high and the high school. And so the internal mixing in this setting is like a separate building. It has the same effect on the pattern of relations that kids are going through. And this emerges naturally from an analytic standpoint from simply plotting the picture, right? So the simplest possible thing that we can do is this is the social gravity that these people are moving through that we're trying to understand. And so the goal of social network analysis is to understand these features, and we have this entire workshop because our standard tools are wanting. Social science research for the past 50 years at least, and this was published in 1968, has been dominated by the survey, which is usually practiced as a sociological meat grinder. The assumption of statistical analysis is that all of our cases are independent. We need that so that our error terms cancel out. If our errors are not independent, then the math gets really ugly and it's really hard to do. And so what we'd like to do is make this assumption that the world is independent. And if we do that, we can get some magical powers, right? I can sample about 400 or 500 people and have standard errors that are small enough to infer reasonable things about the population as a whole, if I assume they're independent. If they're not, right, then those processes are complicated and harder to do, and you need bigger things. And so what we've done in sociology for decades now is sort of push relationships aside and try to turn those into variables and then pretend with blinders on that the connections between people don't actually exist. What this class does, what this whole project does, is to try to get us past that and to think about networks as these systems and to model these systems as interconnected sets in a rigorous statistical and scientifically justifiable way. So social network analysis provides us a set of tools to empirically extend our theoretical intuition to patterns of composition. Linton Freeman sort of nicely laid this out in the 70s for what are the things that make social network analysis, and he argues that it's motivated by the structural intuition that we've just described. It's grounded in systematic and empirical data, draws heavily on this graphical imagery, and relies on the use of mathematical tools to summarize these pieces. And it turns out that this has been a pretty productive research program. Over time, the growth in social network analysis has been dramatic and increasing across the board. On social networks in health itself, you see a rapid rise. This is from the Web of Science. And if you think about networks, papers that have published with the word networks and health in them has been this rise. This is what the obesity literature on the same data set looks like, just to give you a comparison. So there's a lot of work on this area. And the number of grants and the grant values have been about the same. 2025 and 2026, perhaps, we'll see. There may be a blip in this chart. But the reason for this growth and the reason for this drive is because there is value in understanding this. There are problems we want to understand that the science and the fields recognize can be tackled with these kind of approaches. So what are some of the features that drive our underlying sort of intuition behind this work? The broad umbrella for social networks in health is coming out of what's known as the social determinants of health literature. And the argument for the social determinants of health is that the biological features that drive health outcomes are situated within contexts, and those contexts shape both the ways in which our bodies, our cells respond to assaults in nature, and the practices that we engage in that also create our kinds of problems. So there's this joint feature of differences in susceptibility and exposure and differences in responses and activities that create a new way in which the social features condition the likelihood of health. This is, believe it or not, this is probably an obvious point for this audience, but it's not when you think about the standard research in biological models, right? A mouse is a mouse is a mouse. A fruit fly is a fruit fly. C. elegans is C. elegans, and it's beautiful because I can model it and it's right there. What we're saying is that a person is not a person, right? That a person in Montana is different than a person in North Carolina, and if there's connections between the two, that creates something interesting. And so understanding the social determinants of health takes seriously the notion that people are reactive agents. And as reactive agents, we're going to do things to our own selves, like smoking and drinking and lying and all sorts of things that create our own problems. But we're also going to be exposed to different kinds of pathogens if I live in a rural area versus an urban area, close to water versus a desert. And so these kinds of features create heterogeneities that typical scientific models have a hard time dealing with. And so the whole notion of system science and One Health, and so this has come out in a lot of features, is in response to this sort of uniform model of human critters as substitutable bumps. Right? So The network part of that, and specifically, has to do with this notion that not only are people themselves socially conditioned by the world around them, but their health things spill over to others. And so the spillover feature of an effect is both cause for harm and concern and celebration. Because what happens with a spillover effect is if we think about what happens in healthcare of a doctor treating a patient, that's a fixed cost on a unit cost. And if I spend $100 helping teach somebody how to be healthier, that's a benefit to that person. But if that person then tells their cousins and brothers and uncles how to also be healthier and exercise better and eat better, then you end up then getting a big boon to your investment. And so spillover effects are part of what these the network analysis and network approach is trying to do, is to have these kinds of direct features not just work with the patient as our focal unit, but how the patient's social context can channel some of this information and investment. And that's good. That's great if you're trying to teach people how to test for HIV, for example. It's bad if they're smoking. And so what our goal as public health researchers is to find a way to help channel this work and understand what flows when. Right? So how do we do this? We do this by thinking through a series of general models. And for the sociologists in the room, I'm stealing this directly from Wayne Baker, who's an economic sociologist. But this is also what's known as Coleman's boat model. There's a whole series of versions of this if you haven't seen it before. But the basic model we work with is a levels model of aggregation and feedback. That there are behavioral assumptions we make about people, right? And some of those assumptions are good assumptions, some are bad. That's part of what we're working on. Those assumptions generate micro-networks. The tendency to have reciprocity, to whether you use a condom or not when you're having sex, right? Whatever it might be, depending on the context, there's a microstructure of a network. And that microstructure of a network is built on the local action that people have. So this is the situation that people are living in. It affects who they interact with and how they have those interactions. Those aggregate. And the point here, this is a magic little step, right? That aggregation from what an individual does to what a system does relies on people's systematically doing similar things writ large. So if there's a tendency based on our behavioral assumption that people prefer people like themselves and distrust people unlike themselves, that's the homophily bias. And if everybody has some level of homophily bias, you're going to generate social systems that are clustered. Right? So it's a very simple idea, but the movement from this pattern of micro-networks to pattern of macro-networks requires an aggregation step that is a lot of work. Once you have that pattern of macro-networks, that generates a whole series of outcomes that we might find interesting. So there's a classic set of examples of this in political networks. We have this notion of balance or friendship balance. A friend of a friend is a friend. My enemy's enemy is my friend. Right? So this is a classic sort of notion that we're all aware of. If everybody behaves that way, right? If everyone has balanced networks, then the macrostructure has one of two possibilities and only two possibilities. You either get kumbaya or you get polarization. That's all that can happen. Now, that's the implication of a model. The model is everybody does this. If not everybody does this, then this macroeconomic outcome can't happen. But how they don't do it is interesting, right? And so models are wrong. All models are wrong, but some models are useful. That's a trope that's going to come through this thing as we go. More direct for us, if you're thinking of something like health behavior, right? So people adopt the behavior of their friends. What that means is that people who are dissimilar become similar. That creates clustered networks of similarity, and that affects the speed at which other things diffuse, right? So these kind of models, this is the trope that's going to go through the social determinants of health facet of social networks models. That was the world's fastest introduction to why we do networks in health. Questions? I have a bad joke, which is that I talk fast, but you're smart, so I figure you can listen fast. If you're not, let me know, and I'll no, I'm kidding. Do slow me down at any point, but I get excited about these things, so here we go. All right, questions, comments, or thoughts, concerns on motivation before we sort of get into what the hell is this stuff? Awesome, you guys are great. As some of the people who have taken my undergraduate classes know, I will cold call you. So don't be shy jumping in if things get going too much. So how do we think about what networks are and take this buzzing mess of a hairball that you see on these plots and make sense of it? The The strategy that I use, and this is coming from some work that Craig Rawlings and myself and Dan McFarland and Jeff Smith, we have a new textbook on this that's going to come out, Blatant Self-Promotion. We divide networks into two basic worlds. There's a connectionist approach to networks and a positional approach to networks. And then once you have these two sort of rows, if you will, you have different levels that you can think about networks. So you have local networks or ego networks up to whole systems of the world. And I'm going to talk through all these elements directly. But this rubric helps us sort of narrow the problem set. And you'll see that it's that like all rubrics, it fails, but I think it fails in informative ways. And so we'll go from there. So what do I mean by a connectionist model? A connectionist model is networks are pipes. Things flow through networks, and the things that flow through networks are the things that we can. We want to know whether our pipes are clogged or our pipes are open. That's the basic notion of networks as pipes. This is probably what 90% of the world thinks of when they think about why networks matter. Diseases flow across network, rumors flow, misinformation, money. So things flow through networks because one node is connected to another. A positional effect says that we care about networks because the context around nodes shapes their incentives. It shapes the things that they have access to. And so nodes that are in similar positions, even if nothing's flowing between them directly, will behave similarly because they face similar social contexts. This is the classic vice president problem. Right? Vice presidents are useless. They have no job except to wait for presidents to die. That's what vice presidents do. And so every vice president is frustrated and useless and spend all their time trying to make themselves relevant because the position is such that they're not connected to any real responsibilities. And so that means you can have some like Mondale that did nothing and some like Cheney that did a lot, right? Because the position itself is undefined in any real way. Right? And so if you think about that, there's that notion is everywhere. You have robbers and teachers, you have cops, you have mothers, like all of these things, these labels we have in society are people who exchange with others in systematic ways and thus have different kinds of constraints. All right. So digging into this a little bit deeper, what do we mean by a connectionist point of view? So I think many of us here have either an epidemiological background or have gone through COVID and so have probably seen R0 once or twice in the last 5 years. And so there's a couple different ways you can express what R0 is, but R0 is the reproductive rate of an infection, and so it's the number of new cases from each incidental case. And we like to, in a network standpoint, one way to write this is to say that R0 depends on the infectivity of the bug moving through, the likelihood of contact, and the duration of infectiousness. And the likelihood of contact, this little c here, is where your network lives. And so what does this mean? If you were to imagine a sexual network and the spread of a sexually transmitted disease, you might go out and interview a bunch of people who have had sex and ask them about their last two partners. This would be a standard survey approach to understanding the spread of disease. And you would ask them what happened in that encounter, and your data effectively look like a set of isolated dyads and triads that are out there. Right? But these dyads and triads are connected to a larger set. This is from the Ad Health data. This is a real high school in North America. And what you see here out of about the 300 kids that are or so that are romantically involved, about 270 or 170 of them, excuse me, are connected in this giant connected component. So if you have teenagers, I'm sorry, right? This is what this looks like. If you ever were a teenager and your mom told you you're sleeping with everyone your partner ever slept with, that's what this is, right? That's what this is. She was right in response to Mother's Day. But from our standpoint, what's interesting is that these folks, right, are very different ricks from these folks, even though locally they look the same. And so the connectionist model of networks is that we want to figure out what generates this system of pipes and how it's different from these systems of pipes, right, how it works. And it turns out that there's lots of different ways to think about the network portion of connectivity. So I've substituted out that C for N sub D. And so if we think about the disease-relevant networks that are moving through that we care about for the spread of disease, we can think about different ways to characterize that network. And sometimes, right, that network is very simple. And we do things that, or we make assumptions about that network that allow us to do good modeling. And so sometimes we can do this like literally closed form equations or very close to it if we assume that contact is random. right? So if we have an Erdos random graph, then there's some good math that we can do to figure this out directly. If it's a set of linked random graphs, also known as compartments, we can do this really simply. If it's a static graph that is random except for very small sort of differences in the degrees, we can deal with that. If it's tree-like, so there's lots of things we can do. So there's a whole universe of networks for which we can do great sort of, formal analysis of these things. Excuse me. However, most of the time, the networks we're interested in practically don't fit the assumptions of those kinds of models. Right? It's probably the case, for example, that our networks change faster than the disease is spreading. So if you care about something like an STD, like HIV, that's a slow-burning infection that people have for their whole lives. And so their networks are moving much faster than the disease is moving through it, and that complicates understanding of these models. The networks admit to a lot of unobserved clustering. There's an active feedback between getting sick and engaging in relations. Right? These things complicate our understanding. It makes those simpler models harder to do. An example of that, which is you could take a very simple behavioral model and say that when people, that people are basically good, but they get tired of following orders quickly. Right? So, as a public health official, I know that if people go out when they're sick, they're going to spend a lot of time with other people and get other people sick. So one quick way to sort of stamp down an infection is to say, look, there's too much infection in my world, stay home. We're going to have a stay-at-home order. And the first time this happens, the population is like, yep, thank you. We're all in this together. We're going to bend the curve. We're going to do it ourselves. And so there's going to be very high compliance. So the public health office sees that we've reached our threshold at which we're going to have a stay-at-home order. We do it. Most people comply. That's great. But they lift the order before the disease goes away entirely, because the disease never goes away entirely. And then it comes back up again. And the second time, oh crap, I've seen this movie before, so I'm going to comply, but I'm not going to comply as fast, and I'm not going to comply as completely. And so the peak is bigger. And then we do it again, and again, and again. And so a very simple two-parameter model, which is the amount of time that I'm willing to spend at home without complaining about it, and my fatigue rate, will generate this kind of oscillation pattern, which is not an unreasonable sort of qualitative set of how the actual COVID epidemic sort of had those ebbs and flows, right? Excuse me. So, and then you can layer over things like this, like as these things move in these spurts and sets, you get different kinds of mutations, and those mutations happen in different ways, and so there's there are spillovers that happen across the set. And there's lots of other ways, which I think, which is even perhaps the flip side of this, which is not that the shape of the network is determined by our behaviors, but the network itself gets shaped by all the other things that are going on in our lives. That is, that this contact network is itself a function of human social systems. It's a function of our beliefs, our practices, our family, and so forth. And so understanding those things requires us to build into a lot of social sciences, a lot of geological sciences, a lot of physical space and planning and so forth, because humans are connected in all of these different kinds of settings. And so one of the things that makes network analysis so interesting from a social health standpoint is that it's not just biology, it's not just medicine. It is a deeply interdisciplinary field. My bias is sociological because I'm a sociologist, but I've worked with as many disciplines as you can name, and it is fascinating. We have so much fun because of that. And we get to learn and this is because humans are not C. elegans, right? We're not a substitutable system. We have to understand the systems that we're embedded in. So the connectionist model is all about what shapes that network. The positional model is about understanding systematic regularities in the underlying pattern of networks. So imagine I give you this little network. There are 5 people in it. 2 of those people share romantic love, and those 2 people feed 3 others who constantly bicker with each other. I'll bet you can name, right, these positions. Right? You don't need me to label this graph. Right? So we have parents and we have children. Now, if I were to also say that the feeding line went from this, you'd probably have the stereotypical wife and husband, right? And we'd get rid of those, right? So we know how this work rolls, right? We know this work because we've all lived this existence, right? And so the positional model in social network analysis is the idea that regular social interactions constrain our understanding and vision of the world. And those regular patterns of interactions are knowable. And it builds on a system that is known as role theory. And so the idea of role theory is that most of social life, some people in the exchange theory paradigm would say all, but I'm going to just say most for now, that most of social life are a series of either explicit or implicit social exchanges. I give to you, you give to me. And that's expressed in terms of roles. So teachers are just like crazy people on the sidewalk if they don't have students, right? So I might give a lecture like this on the sidewalk, but if you're not here listening to it, I'm an idiot, I'm a fool, I'm crazy, right? But the fact that you're here gives me validation, so my craziness has an audience to go to. And so we have this kind of notion that everything comes in pairs. We have teachers and students, we have cops and robbers, we have lovers and lovers, right? So these things work together. We have parents and kids. And they're all determined by the pattern of exchanges. That teachers give things to students that they don't give to their kids. I think of you as all as my children, or more my undergraduates than sort of you, but you're not my children, right? I don't pay your tuition, right? I don't discipline you. Like, there's lots of things that teachers don't do for parents. And so the slice of what parents do for kids is very different than what teachers do for kids. The slices of what people do for pets are looking a lot more like what people do for children than it did 50 years ago. 50 years ago, it was fine to put my pet outside on a rope. I wouldn't do that now, right? And you wouldn't let me, right? I can't put my kids outside on a rope either, right? So there's this notion of what we do with others is determined by the pattern of exchanges that we have with them. And anything that one person does with another can be conceived of, with a little bit of theoretical twisting, as an exchange. That I do something for you and I get something in back, something in return. And that exchange process defines expected role behavior. And expected role behavior, if expected role behavior is just a system of exchanges, i.e. a system of relations amongst a set of nodes, it becomes a graph. And that's beautiful, right? Because now we have a network that we can model in multiple relations and characterize types of people by the unique pattern of exchanges they have. Now sometimes that's a really complicated way to get a parent. I don't need parents. I don't need network analysis to figure out who parents are and who children are. But the point is, and the fundamental assumption of this branch of network analysis is that there's a lot of social relations we have that we don't have labels for, that we don't have sort of systematic sort of ideas that we build inside, but instead they emerge unique in each social system. So one school might have something like a popular joker, and another school, jokers are outcasts. Well, this is a difference across those evolving social systems. And whereas models for how these systems come to be, but our job from an analyst is ad hoc and ex post to sort of look at these features and say, what is that? Right? When I have this pattern of relations, how do I figure out what type of person this is, and do those people act in the same way? For our standpoint, do they act the same way with respect to health behaviors? So does the occupancy of a role create a different kind of outcome? Now, as it turns out, there are, if you were to think about sort of the bulk of what social network analysis in health is, it's probably 95-5 connectionist and positional. This is the bias of sociology and anthropology. I love the positional stuff, so you're going to get a little more than that than you might in the other, but most of what we deal with is diffusion and spread over connectionist networks. All right, questions on the big picture sort of goals. I told you this was fast. You're getting it all at once. All right, so a little bit of overview of what the field is. Great. Myself and Ashton, has he made it here yet today? Yeah, Ashton and Alex wrote this paper a few years ago now. Yeah, excuse me. To try to map what amongst the things of social networks in health, what do we actually study? So again, we pointed out before, this has been this rapid growth in social networks in health, and so we'd like to make sense of this entire literature. And so what we do is a little trick called, where we map the literature as a network. One of the jokes that my colleagues realize is that I am not just a network empiricist, but a network imperialist. Everything is a network. I mean, if you want to see colonialism in real life, you're going to see it today. So everything can become a network if you give me enough time. So in this case, each node is a paper, so it's a text that a person wrote. And 2 points are similar if they share a lot of words. And we weight those words in fancy ways, but that's really all you need to know, is that two papers that talk about the same stuff share a link, and 2 papers that don't share a link. And so we can map a little model of a small literature around this paper. So these, half a dozen papers are on HPV and MySpace back in the day. And so that paper then is embedded between clusters of papers that are all on smoking and Twitter and HPV. And I don't know why I'm coughing so much. And so this is a nice way to think about, in this case, an interstitial paper. Right? The beauty is we can do the same thing. If we can do this with a dozen papers, we can do it with 18,000 papers. And so this is a map. Excuse me. I'm so sorry. Just try not to cough in your ears. I apologize. All right. So the beauty of the field of social networks and health is that it ends up being a pretty great representation of the health field, right? So we're studying everything from social aging and support, right, to HIV, to adolescence, to health policy systems and the ways in which hospitals operate, and a whole bunch of disease processes that are built in between it, from cancer to heart disease and obesity. And the example paper I just showed on HPV is about there, but there are bunches and bunches of these, and I'm not going to go through a whole lot of it. But what's fun about a field like this is you can think about some core ideas in the literature. Something like Rogers' Diffusion of Innovations, which is this beautiful book about how people adopt new ideas. And it turns out that work has informed almost everything in this field. Whereas Tom Valente's work, right, in a similar way, who's picked up on a lot of the work on adolescence and smoking and work on HIV, as well as the adoption of beliefs in health systems and the ways that health systems organize. Christakis and Fowler's work on the spread of obesity has been cited all over this place. Ad health, as you might expect, is only in the adolescence world, but it's a little bit over in the policy side. Bernice Pescosolido's work on mental health and social support. It's typically topics about race has been spread all over this, ranging from individual behaviors on the left to system behaviors on the right. Gender has been largely focused on questions that have to do with essentially individual level outcomes, whereas particular disease questions have been spread all over the place. So this is, again, I read the paper if you want. There's a whole lot of things about this that are details that I'm not going into, but I just want to attune you to the idea. There's a lot of stuff out here. NIH has historically invested a lot in this topic. So just this year, these are all currently active grants as of 2025, as of 2 weeks ago anyway, where I went through and searched for keywords that in the tags from Reporter that had to do with networks of, avoiding computer networks and intercellular biological networks. And so it's great, right? So the NSF and the NIH have traditionally invested a lot of effort and energy into these processes, including lots of money. So now I've switched the axes on you. And so this is, the amount of money that NIA, for example, has invested has historically been quite dramatic. And so that's great. And it's spread all over the country, red states, blue states alike. So we spent a lot of money at NIH on network research, and their goal is to help us understand how to do that well in this class. And this is the topics that NIH, if you do that same topic map, it's kind of fun. There is a bunch of stuff coming in sort of the mechanisms of internal cell sort of networks, but also all of the social things, and a huge sort of movement across different disease systems. So it's really a beautiful sort of way to understand, again, just how interdisciplinary this network approach is. Our grant is right here. So this is the R25. We live over here in this little training, in the valley between training and substance. That's where we are. Okay. So, what is this workshop and where are we going today? The plan today is to, or the plan this week is to work through sort of the research process. And there's a standard sort of, this research process is not necessarily network specific. The questions need data, data need exploration, modeling, and results. And this is this classic scientific feedback process. And we try to echo that a little bit today, or this week. And so today, we're going to talk about, this whole week, hopefully, is about research questions. Right? We hope that you're getting new ideas that you're here. And that comes some from what I say and what your other speakers say, but a lot from talking to each other. So spend your time getting to know your neighbor and understanding what they're doing. Data collection is going to be largely today and on Thursday. So we're going to have some specific modalities of data collection today, and then examples and best case scenarios and sort of get your hands dirty kind of things on Thursday. In terms of metrics, we're going to not, the most of the metrics and scoring work is the focus of the beginners workshop, so we're not going to do a lot of this. I'm going to cover it a little bit more here in the next hour or so, but otherwise that's the extent of scoring. I'm going to do a deep dive on Friday on sort of some strange metrics, things you might not have thinking about, but really more approaches to learning how to create your own metrics is what that will be on. We do a lot on data exploration, so Tom's going to talk about some of our new tools for that today. We'll do some data visualization and community detection next week, and then a bunch of work on modeling. Right? And so modeling is the process just generally of abstracting from your data sort of toy systems that help us generate understanding. And models can be really simple and they can be really complex depending on what they're needed for. And so there's a lot of different versions of that. We're going to go deep into the weeds on a lot of these. All right. And then finally, we hope to hear a lot about how people are working in the field and some of the things that they're getting done. So we'll have some of that work. So how do you deal with this week, right? So crap, this is a lot of stuff that we're going to be dealing with. Like I said, this is the fire hose. What I implore you to do is to focus on the ideas in the big picture. Everything is recorded, both in video and all the slides are up on the Google Drive, so you'll have plenty of time to go back and review them and look at that. And so spend your time doing that. You can always get details from a second pass. People have this tendency to really worry about coding. We're not going to spend a lot of time teaching you how to code today. Getting code is easy, and it's getting easier every day, right? So for example, if you're a naive person and ask Chat's little internal data analytic thing to say, if I give you an edge list, can you plot it? And it says, sure, I'm happy to, right? And so this is the kind of thing that you can get, and it turns out that it does a pretty good job, right? And so you can get code itself pretty well. It turns out that the days of, the only way to get code is to open Moody's book and go to the, page 50 and sort of copy it down. Those days are gone, right? But you need to know how to ask the questions. If you don't know what questions to ask Chat, if you don't know what the right answer is supposed to look like, you're going to get garbage. So Chat, like anything else, can generate garbage just as easily as any other computer program you've dealt with. And even though I've named mine and he's nice and I have a very deep, very personal relationship with my chatbot, I don't trust him, right? I really don't. And the only way you know that is by having spent the time doing it. So I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth. I recognize that you need to code, you need to spend time coding, you need to engage with it, but don't worry about it this week. This is not a coding week. This is a learning and conceptual week where you can learn these ideas, and so that you know the questions to ask, and you know that when the answers you get are garbage, right? And so the only way you get that is by spending time with this group and thinking about, you can spend it with a different group. But one of the things you'll get out of this group is learning how to do that. All right. Take a breath. I'm now going to give you network analysis, the nuts and bolts of what's a node, what's an edge, what's a centrality score. I'm going to do the everything you should have learned in the last the other workshop in the next 45 minutes. Yeah, woohoo! Here we go. So take a breath. We all good? We all have coffee? All right. We've said hi to our neighbors. All right. I grew up in a Protestant tradition. Like the tradition in church is to stand up and like shake the hand of the person behind you you haven't met, right? I'm not going to call you to the front to a call to the altar, but it'll be close, all right? All right, so what is a network, right? Grab a coffee if you need it, that's fine. You cannot offend me by getting up and moving around. I get it, this is a lot of time here. So a network fundamentally is a set of sets. And all of the extensions of networks we're going to do are also sets of sets. A set is a collection of items. And so for a network, you have two collections of items. One collection of nodes, which typically are people, right? And so in our context, but often, and more often now, they've become other things like organizations or even ideas or people. That set is what all of our social science training has been about. So node sets you know how to deal with. The typical sort of notion of a rectangular data set with cases down the rows, attributes across the columns, and then you run a correlation or 1,000 other things. That is like our bailiwick. We can do that all day long. The thing that makes a network different from that is the second set, which is the set of relation or the set of edges. And these are sets of pairs of nodes, right? And those pairs of nodes are characterized in various ways. So they might be friends, they might be lovers, they might be enemies, and so there's a whole series of attributes that goes on those edges. And these two things together become the network. So it's the set of edges as linked through the set of nodes, and that creates your set, or your network. Now, it turns out, because it's an interdisciplinary field that's been going on since at least the 1930s, jargon is rife. It is everywhere, and we use different languages in different subparts of the field. So I refer to nodes, you might refer to vertices, you might refer to points. Better to sometimes refer to people if you're dealing with that. That's not so bad. Also, in terms of relations, you can have edges, arcs, lines, ties. Like these terms are all exchangeable. And for those of you that are sticklers on terminology, I apologize. You're just not going to find consistency across this set. So how do these networks look? So the simplest possible network are two features that we want to define networks on are the directionality and the qualitative elements of the edge, the valued edges. And so since all of life is a 2x2, we have either the directionality side or we have the valued side. And so you can have an undirected binary graph. This is the simplest possible network. This is a network where each edge is either on or off. So I was either in the workshop with you or I was not, right? And so it's binary and it's undirected. If I did it with you, you must have done it with me. If I'm in the workshop with you, you can't not be in the workshop with me. It's a necessarily symmetric relationship. And so this actually has a lot of things that are this. A directed relationship is one where if I do something to you, it's not necessarily the case that you do it to me. So if I bore you, you may not bore me, right? So those are two different things, right? And so oftentimes, these types we ask, the directionality comes from the questions we ask. So we'll give people a survey. We'll say, who's your best friend? And I'll say, Dana's my best friend. And Dana says, who? Right? And so it goes out and it goes in. And so it might be that I pine after someone and they ignore me, or it's reciprocal. Friendship as a relationship is the kind of thing that we expect normally to be reciprocated. But it's not necessarily reciprocated. And that's what it means to be directional. A valued tie means there's some cardinal ordering to the edges, that you go from low to high. And so it's either I've been in a workshop with you for a day, or I've been in a workshop with you for a week. And so those things are different elements and different values on the relations. And of course, you can have a directed value tie as well. I can like you a lot, but you can like me a little. Right? And so that's the basic idea there. Now, traditionally, we've represented networks, valued networks, if they're small, with, say, putting a value right on the edge in this case. So here we see the value is B. Or you've used something like the thickness or the shading of the lines. Those quickly disappear as the networks get larger, but that's part of the set. Now, it turns out that you can have multiple types of relations on the same set of nodes as well. And so this is known as a multiplex network. A multiplex network is one where we're not just friends, but we're also coworkers, we're also collaborators, we might be enemies. So all of these different types of relations can be layered on top of the network. And this is known as a multiplex network. And the same sort of sets of directionality and value ties are applied on there as well. So there should have been, sorry. I had a whole series of other things. Well, not that there's not enough to talk about. So, and we'll go back to that. So I'm going to expand that list in a bit of what types of networks are, but I'm going to do a couple things first. I think I remember what happened. So first, let's think about the levels of networks. So a common, especially in social networks and health, is something called an ego network. An ego network is an individual, a focal node, and the people they're directly tied to. The beauty of ego networks is they tend to be one of the fastest things to collect survey-wise. And so you can say, you can randomly sample the GSS, you can do a national sample of the world, right, and ask people who their friends are. And so you get a focal individual and the people around them. There are other ways to get that data, but it's most commonly done from a survey standpoint, and there are lots of things that you can do with ego networks. A partial network is a sort of a junk term, but the idea is that we move beyond that sort of individual and the people they're directly tied to, and we ask those people to tell us about who they're tied to. And so snowball samples, link tracing samples, either you might try to get the whole population or you go to your budget runs out, right? So there's lots of different versions of this, but the idea is you've captured more than the local, but not quite the complete. And the complete or global network data or sociocentric data, I've never liked that word sociocentric. It's just an ugly word from like a language standpoint, but anyway, I usually use the word complete, and the idea here is that for whatever bounded population you have observed all the relations relevant to the data questions you're asking. Notice that I snuck in a couple of sneaky words there, right? So it's a bounded population and relevant relations, and neither of those two things are actually probably true, right? And so in fact, despite the fact that our assumption for everything we're working with is going to be that we have a complete or global network data until we talk about when we don't, in reality, we usually have a partial network, right? And so we'll talk about why that matters in a bit. Graphically, you can think about this as a building up from the bottom to the top. So we have a dyad or a best friend, an edge, and then we move up to the ego network, to some other subgroup, the partial group or primary group, a snowball sample, and then the whole network. The main difference practically between a partial network, there's inference differences, but the main difference from an analytic standpoint from a partial network and a global network is that you can't get isolates in a partial network because you can't snowball to people who have no contacts. So if I'm talking about people who are co-sponsoring a bill and I'm a new senator and I hate everybody and I've never co-sponsored a bill, then asking a train of people who they co-sponsored with, you'll never find the isolated senator. We only wish that our senators were isolated. Okay. The other sort of dimension of networks that we want to think about are the modes of the networks. And so what do I mean by this? So the standard network of relations is actually what's called a one-mode network. And what that means is that there's only one class of nodes. Those nodes might have different attributes, but any node could, in principle, connect to any other node. So in our high school example, any kid could be a friend with another kid. Even black kids can be friends with white kids, but they might choose not to, right? So there's a difference between what is revealed in the data and what's necessary in the data. A two-mode or a bipartite network says that there are necessary logical distinctions between one class of node and the other that require relationships to be between classes as opposed to within classes. And the classic example that scholars like us should know about is co-authorship. So co-authors are connected to each other by virtue of writing a paper together. So people are connected to papers. We share the paper. We don't write each other, right? So co-authors aren't literally writing each other. We're writing papers with each other. And so there's this effect. So you have people as member of groups, authors on papers, words used, events and lives, and so forth. And so the idea here is that all the relations happen between the sets. The classic example in sociology is the Davis Women's Data Set, in which you have, I can't remember, it's like 17 women attended about a dozen lunches. These are Southern ladies who lunch, and they have ties with each other. And it turns out that those ties are kind of informative, and so it's sort of a fun feature. What's nice about these bipartite networks, which is another way to refer to two-mode networks, is that the two-mode network, the thing you observe, can be projected in two different sets. So I can have the person-to-person projection, which says a count of how often people have lunch together. Or I can have the event-to-event projection, which says how often or how many people attended both of these lunches. And that duality is rife through social life. It turns out that almost everything we do, right, has a dual aspect, that every coin has a heads and a tails. And the duality is something that we're able to explore in very fascinating ways. The other thing I love about bipartite and dual networks is that these data are everywhere. And so when I tell you, right, that Moody is a network imperialist, I'm putting a lot of weight on this trick, because I can take a survey and say every time you've answered a question, like 2 people that have answered the question, they've now linked to the survey. So you treat a survey as a psychometric instrument, I treat it as a national sample of belief networks, right? So there's a way in which we can build these things, right, off this duality idea. Theoretically, the thing that makes it interesting is that oftentimes, because we are egoistic apes, that's kind of what we are, we tend to think about this projection all the time. We think about how people are connected to each other and how ideas move through co-authorship networks, but in fact, there's a lot operating on the dual, right? And so things that are happening on the dual don't disappear because we don't think about them, right? They're still processing, they're still there, and we tend to not recognize that they're simultaneously conditioning each other. Ron Breiger's work, his entire career, or at least one facet of his entire career, has been focusing on this linkage between the duality of persons and groups, and how things like, reservation opportunities for lunch constrain the likelihood that people know each other, right? So this is the dual feature that is there. All right. The trick that you're going to learn in this class is that every element you have that moves from one thing to the next could be extended ad infinitum, right? So we can go from 1 mode to 2 mode. Turns out we can go from 2 modes to 3 modes. We can go from 3 modes to an infinite number of nodes if you wanted to, right? And so you can have tripartite networks, which would be something like students who are members of programs that are also connected to staff, right? So every graduate student is in a program, and those programs might share staff, for example. So that's a tripartite network. And you can go up as long as you want. Logically, these ideas are extendable. In practice, it really becomes a question of whether the overhead of having a second mode outweighs the advantage of treating these as attributes of one mode or the other. And so just keep it in mind. The version of this that becomes the biggest thing that you can do is known as a multi-layer network. And so a multi-layer network combines essentially any network that you've thought about thus far and stacks it together. And there's some linkages within layer, that could be transportation, and some linkages between layers. It could be identities or something. And so these become a generalized feature of edges, and each edge is characterized by the layer it lives in and the rules that govern that layer. And we'll talk about those in more detail later. So this is in the slides. I'm not going to go through this table in detail. This is just basically what I just told you. But the classic things that we're going to spend a little bit of time this week talking about are these 5 sort of sets of networks. So we're going to talk about ego networks and sociocentric networks, ad nauseum. We'll spend a bit of time talking about bipartite and multiplex networks, and I'll mention a few tricks you can do with multi-layer networks. That's kind of where it's going to go. Now, turns out there's a lot more you could yet do if you wanted, right? So there are a whole series of things that are special cases of the graphs we've already talked about, or extensions to new things. So for example, a subtype of graph that is quite interesting and is under the hood of lots of things that we do is a spanning tree. And so a spanning tree itself isn't perhaps a health relevant thing that you care about, except that once you realize that the result of a diffusion process is a spanning tree. So if you understand how spanning trees work, even though the social activity isn't on the spanning tree, you might learn something about the way in which disease trajectories have to grow by the properties of spanning trees. And so these are the kinds of things you can learn when you know this. And so this is just to whet your appetite for a whole line of things that you can spend time working on. If you want to spend your career in geeky sort of things that we like to play with, that's there. One thing that is worth to keep in mind is that everything sort of above this blue bar and on the last set are also colored by these kinds of features that on the bottom, which is that they are typically dynamic if they're social, right? So social networks change over time. They can be signed. So a signed graph says that there's a qualitative distinction between positive and negative. So an enemy is not just a bad friend, right? So it's a qualitative difference to be a negative tie than to be a positive tie. A flow-through network means that there's something that actually moves through this set, and so some networks are flow networks, like who shares paperback books, whereas some networks are sentiment networks, and that's a distinction of how things move. And then you're going to know this more often than you want, is that most of the graphs that we actually work with are probabilistic. And so the edges that we observe are random draws from a population distribution that we actually happen to see that day. And if we had surveyed them on a different day, we would see a different set of edges. And generally, what we as social scientists want to know is not the actual edge, but the probability of that edge, and more importantly, the system that generated that distribution of probabilities. And so, so it turns out that a lot of things that we measure are indicators for things that we want to know, but not the thing we actually want to know. Do all right so far? Awesome. Okay. So how do we do this? Right? What are the actual features we work with? So the main features we work with is the main data element we work with is this thing called an adjacency matrix. This is the first of many asterisks in this talk. We don't actually work with adjacency matrices. We work with sparse representations of adjacency matrices, which is a different story entirely. But conceptually, right, you want to think about an adjacency matrix, because once you have a matrix, you can do matrix algebra, and once you can do matrix algebra, the world is yours, right? So, so what is this? What is an adjacency matrix? An adjacency matrix is a two-mode array where you have the same set of nodes down the rows and across the columns, and relations go from the rows to the columns. And that's the tradition in social science, is that the sent ties are across the rows, the received ties are read down the columns. Different disciplines have different conceptions. So just make sure that, I mean, in most of our world, it's going to be rows and columns as senders and receivers, but be aware of what you have when you have directionality. So the way this works, this is an undirected binary graph, so the tie is either 0 or 1, and if it's because it's undirected, anything above the diagonal is going to be mirrored below the diagonal. And so we can see an exact process. If you have a directed network, a binary network, you still have zeros and ones, but you've lost the mirroring. So now we see, for example, that B receives a tie from C, but B does not send to C. A valued tie becomes simple, right? Because now instead of a 0 or 1, I just have a value. Right? I just replace that with what's there, and you're good to go. Now it turns out that practically adjacency matrices are good for thinking about, but hard to work with, because they take up a lot of space and they're hard to, you can't put them anywhere. So what we typically do is we have a couple of different representations. One is called an adjacency list. This is where each row is a person and each column is the people they're related to, and you'd have as many columns as you need to capture the relationship. This is what survey researchers like, because we know how to do this data, right? So this is just each person just becomes my friend 1, friend 2, friend 3. It's a cumbersome data set to work with from an analytic standpoint, so you don't see it a lot in some of the things we do, but except for that one day when you get your data back from the survey researcher and you have this unwieldy thing you have to convert into something you can do. The thing we typically work with is an edge list or an arc list. This is a one row for each relationship, and the content of that data element are the node IDs. And so A and B, B and A, and B and C. And the beauty about an edge list is then that all of the qualitative features that we want to think about are just tacked on as separate columns to that edge list. So I can have the value of the tie, I can have the valence of the tie, I can have the qualitative element of the tie. All of this can be just put on. And you can do the same thing with an adjacency list. The problem is that you then just need to build a correspondence between these elements, which is not trivial. It's easy to make mistakes. So we don't do that often. For a two-mode network, you still have an adjacency matrix, but we call it an incidence matrix, and it's no longer square, or it's no longer necessarily square. So for example, I have a series of events, A through F, and a series of people, 1 through 5, and it's again just an indicator of whether or not event A and person 5 share each other, or together share each other. What's the right? Person 1 attends every event A. Those are the data structures. You'll see others as we go along. If you have questions about how to practically move your data around, ask us. We're going to do a lot of that today. All right, so what do you do with this data once you have it? I'm going to build up some common metrics from the simplest to more complex. And you start with, everything starts with volume, just like everything in social life starts with demography. Like, if you don't know who's there, you can't do anything with them. So the classic sort of ways in which we characterize the size of a network are the number of nodes and the number of relations. So in this case, there are 5 nodes and 5 relations. We characterized the volume of this network with this thing called density. And so density is the average value of ties, or the proportion of ties that are present in a binary network. Density ranges from 0 to 1 in a binary network. In a valued network, it need not be capped at 1. It is the mean of the relations, including the zeros. You will notice that the formula for density is n times n minus 1. Why is it n minus 1? Kara? Why do you suppose it's n minus 1 in the denominator? Yes?
Sorry, I'm not very good at public speaking, but
Yes, exactly. For most of the time, see, I told you I'd cold call you. That's what I just keeping you awake. So yeah, the basic idea, that was unfair, and it's perfect, but it's good. So the idea is that and you're going to see this come up all the time in networks, is that the diagonal in a network is a weird thing. The diagonal of an adjacency matrix are the ties to myself. And well, I want you to like yourself. I don't want you to nominate yourself, right? It's not part of my system generally. And so for the vast majority of contexts, the diagonal will be structurally missing. And so it's not part of this is not part of the calculation. There are rare instances when we use it, but for most of what we do, we don't. Okay? So that's the system level volume measure. The individual level volume measure is degree. So it's how many relationships are you incident to? How many ties do you have? And so if the network is directed, I have out degree, which is the number of people I've nominated, or in degree, which is the number of ties I've received. Right? Or reciprocal degree, which is the number of ties that we share with each other, where I like you and you like me. Degree is, is capped by n minus 1. The strength of a network is the corresponds. Let me be clear. Degree is the number of lines each node is incident to. Strength is the sum of those lines. Right? So for a valued network, your degree and your strength might be different. For a binary network, your degree and your strength will be the same, because it's just the number of people you have on or off. There's a couple of tricky things to keep in mind with degree. Degree seems simple. You just add across the adjacency matrix. But when you're coding it, there's a couple of things that, that can happen that might surprise you the first time you see it. So for example, if I ask iGraph to tell me the degree of each node in my network and say the mode is all, which you might think would be you just treat the graph like an undirected graph, you don't get that. What you get is the sum of the in degree and the out degree. So if one person were connected to everyone around them, right, you would end up with a degree that is bigger than the number of people in the network, which should make your head explode. You should be, wait a minute, that can't be right. What's going on? And what's going on is that the actual formal definition of degree is all the edges you're incident to. And I'm incident to edges going out, and I'm incident to edges going in, and so you count them twice. Right? What we care about in sociology is actually the number of people you're connected to, and you might not care that you're connected to them in both ways, in which case what you want to do is say, take the degree on a graph that's treated as undirected and get that count. Right? So these are subtle features, and this is what I tell you when you ask chat to do something for you, right? Chat's going to say, oh yeah, use this. And you might not know not to do it. So just remember, think very carefully that your numbers make sense. Once you have degree is, like I said, degree is like demography. If you don't know the sex distribution or the age distribution of your population, you almost know nothing about what your population is. Saying America is polarized and not realizing that we have a shit ton of really old people, right, is like you don't understand what's happening in the country. Right? So you need these two things. And it's the same thing with the networks. If you don't understand your degree distribution, you don't understand anything else about your network. And so in this particular network, it has a pretty uniform or almost normal degree distribution, really, with a few people that have small ties. This is a small school network, a classroom actually. And the colors are irrelevant for this purpose. But that's very different than the same size network with a very skewed distribution. And some of these skewed distributions, which are typical in networks that we see, are known as power law or scale-free networks, such that the number of ties at each degree is effectively a linear function. And so these kinds of networks, the system dynamics that are going to happen when you have these sort of really critical hubs are very different than the system dynamics that are going to happen in this kind of cohesive set. And that's all dependent on the marginals of your table, on the marginals of your adjacency matrix, which is what the degree distribution is. All right. So moving up from sums of edges, we can think about patterns of edges. And so we move from node characteristics now to dyad characteristics. And dyads, in most of the networks we deal with, dyads come in three flavors. A dyad can be symmetric, it can be or mutual, it can be asymmetric, or it can be null. And that's the dyad. The dyad census is the number of mutual, asymmetric, or null dyads in your network. And so that distribution is a characteristic that underlies the distribution of ties and the distribution of paths in your graph. So in this case, we're often interested in sociology and other kinds of social sciences, whether or not our voluntarily possible directed relationships are directed. And so how often are friends with each other? That's the reciprocity rate. And there's something in sociology known as the norm of reciprocity. We expect that if I invite you to dinner, you're going to invite me to dinner later. And there's a good theory to say that that's the foundation of most of what sociality is to some degree. And so how do we measure it? Well, what we might do is, it turns out, again, this is the theme of the day, is that things are always more complicated than you expect they are. There's lots of different ways to count mutual ties. And so one way would be global reciprocity, which is that I take the number of mutual dyads and I divide that by the number of non-empty dyads, right? And that gives me one number. The other would be to say, how often do people that send ties receive ties? It's a subtle difference, right? Because one, the unit of analysis is the dyads. The other, the unit of analysis is sent ties. And so the denominator is different, and thus, of course, the total number, the value you get is different. Now, so long as you're consistent in the analysis you do, you're going to be fine. You might also say that what I'm really interested in is not just the amount of reciprocity, but the amount of reciprocity above chance. Well, that's this complicated thing, right? And that's yet another measure, right? And again, I thought I had it here. When you ask iGraph to do mutuality, it's going to give you have to know which option to give in all three. And then later in the notes, I must have hid the slides. It's down in here. Okay. So we've done edges, we've done nodes, we've done edges, we've done dyads. Let's keep growing. Let's do triads. So triads are collections of three nodes, A, B, and C. And every triad is composed of dyads, so every triad could be characterized in a directed graph by its distribution of mutual, asymmetric, or null ties. And this is what's become known as the man labeling system for triads. So here I present to you the periodic table of social elements. I love the triad distribution. It is my favorite thing in networks, more so than most of my colleagues. They think I'm nuts. But I'm going to try to convince you that this is, in fact, just like the chemical periodic table. That is, that each element, you have hydrogen over here where there's nothing going on, but it's abundant. The universe is filled with one nucleus. Periodic tables, graphs are filled with empty triads, which just says most of us don't know each other yet, right? So most graphs are not complete, and that's good. That helps us in a lot of ways. But these characteristics, the real beauty of them is that we can think about the characteristics of these small social patterns because they map onto our social behaviors. That's that link between assumptions about behaviors and micro networks. And so, for example, we can characterize each of these triads by the system properties that they drive. And one of them is something like transitivity. And intransitivity, which is that we might expect a friend of a friend is a friend. And if that's true, these elements, right, these are the elements where that's true, where a friend of a friend is a friend, or a friend of a friend is a friend, or a friend of a friend is a friend, right? So anywhere I look in this element, this sentence is true. That's awesome, right? Because now I know something about this social system based on the fact that we expect this to be here. So if lots of people are these and few people are these, that's going to give rise to one kind of a structure. Well, it might also be that, and it's not that a friend of a friend is a friend, it might be that good friends agree on thirds. That Nina and I are good friends, we think Gabe sucks because we're good friends. Nina never thinks Gabe sucks because Nina's the nicest person in the world. But that would be the idea, is that we have this notion that good friends agree. Well, that's hierarchical agreement. And that's a subtle difference from a friend of a friend is a friend. And because there's a couple triads that differ in which ones obey that idea, right? We might have something like, we're just focusing on reciprocity. In fact, there is nothing but dyads. The world is dyadic atomism, and if I like you and you like me, everything else is extra. Well, then we can only have to focus on these three. I think that's probably a bad theory, but it's a theory we can test on this model. And we can do that because every network admits to a distribution of triads, just like every network admits to a distribution of dyads. And every network has a unique distribution of triads, or at least every automorphically equivalent network has a, never mind, there's a distribution of these things, and we know what they are. And that distribution is awesome. To my knowledge, this is the smallest graph that has every possible triad in it. I've not found one smaller than this. I haven't tried to publish it yet, but I think it's my little fun little network game. If you can find a network smaller that has at least one of every triad type, I'd like to see it. Just for fun cases. But the beauty of that is that once you know this distribution, there's some fun math we can do. And so we know the distribution of the triads, and we know how many to expect by random chance with some not too heroic assumptions. And once we have that knowledge, we can know whether or not we have more of one type or not. So we can actually go back to this system and say, well, do I find more of these types of triads than these types of triads? And if I do, then that value is going to be large in this set. And so I can characterize my system that way. Now, intuitively, right, we want to think about these kinds of scores that build on these triads. And we might say that, oh, I want to study transitivity, which is the proportion of ties where a friend of a friend is a friend, which means intuitively that I want a lot of these. I want very few of these. And these ones make my head hurt, right? Because these are mixed. And so there's a lot of this that goes on. And you don't know exactly what to do with that or how to count them. And different analysts count them differently. This is yet one more in my series of examples of where things that you think you're doing right in R, you might not be doing right in R. Which is, for example, if I want to ask how much clustering is in my network, I could follow Watts and Strogatz and say, give me the classic definition of clustering, which is 3 times the number of triangles over the number of connected triples in the network. And that is in iGraph, this thing called transitivity type equals global. Or I could say, give me the number of closed 2 paths over the number of open 2 paths. All right? And that'll give me something slightly different. Or I could say, give me the aggregation, the average local clustering, which is the mean of the ego network density, which has also been used for the same thing. So all 3 of these have been used interchangeably in sentences that say this network has more clustering than we expect by chance. And these 3 numbers differ radically in their cardinal values. So you need to know what you're doing, right, to know what you're saying. And this is just an example of that, right, so where we're at. I like to aggregate up even further, which is say you can take that triad census, right, which is this vector T, which is 16-element vector T. You can weight it by a series of hypotheses that you have about which triads should be present and which triads should not be present. Make some sort of magic about normalizing it, which I'm not going to go into, and get a test statistic that tells you how much your system follows one of these patterns or another. And some really smart people, like Noah Friedkin and others, have built out models of which types of triads distributions fit what types of macrostructures. And so if I have this set of triads, this ranked cluster set, my social system has to look like a sequence of ranked clusters. It can't not. That's the beauty of this kind of model. And whether it's 2 ranks or 3 ranks or 5 ranks, those you don't know from just this distribution. But you know it has to look like this and not like balance opposition and other sorts of macrostructures. And so it's a beautiful sort of underlying set. All right, done with that set. We have about 20 minutes left, and I only have 40 slides to go, so this is not a problem. So the thing that make networks interesting is that they are systems of paths. And so a path is a connection. So once you move beyond triads, now we're going to think about the system as a whole. And so each network is built up from these edges to sequences of edges, which are known as paths. And there are different flavors of paths. And so you can have a strong connectivity or weak connectivity. A strong connectivity in a directed network means that if I can reach you through a series of following the arrows, you can reach me through a series of following the arrows. A weak connectivity means I can reach you or you can reach me. And so it depends on the structure of the network. If I can reach you and you can reach me, and that's true for a whole set of us, we're a component. If it's the maximal set, everyone that all of us can reach, that's a component. So in this case, right, we have a network of one really giant component and a lot of little components. These are all one school, but there's different connectivity structures in this set. A difference between strong and weak components. This is, again, following the directions of the arrows. This entire thing is a weak component, so each node could reach any other node if we ignore the arrows, But if you follow the direction of the arrows, it's the case that the red nodes can reach each other, the blue nodes can reach each other, and the white nodes can be reached by somebody, but can't necessarily reach someone else, or vice versa. One thing to note about connectivity is that it's not the same as pairwise connectivity. So we can share a component, even a strong component, and not share a symmetric relationship. Right? So in this case up here, for example, you can see that there's an asymmetric relation between these two nodes, but it's like there isn't there. High technology, there we go. We can see that this node can reach this node directly. This node can't go this way, but it can go this way. And so connectivity is this sequence of paths that you move through. So the beauty of connectivity from a health standpoint is that small changes at the local level aggregate up, this is that magic I talked about in the very first couple of minutes, to different kinds of global structures. So if I have a network where we're talking about your 3 most recent sexual partners, and what does that network look like? Most people might have 1 or 2, a few people might have 3, and if that's true and the relationships follow a certain sort of set of rules that it's not worth talking about here, you'll end up with these tiny little disconnected components that are less than about 2% of the population of this network. But if I shift just a little bit across the top here, where I move, the average changes very little, but the distribution changes some, where I shift some people from here, to here, right, to this middle in the set, you move from almost no connectivity to massive connectivity. Right? Why does that happen? It happens because I randomly picked, I have no design at all, the cases that are right on what's known as the phase transition. Right? You move from a set of nodes where nothing is happening in the network, nothing is happening, and once you reach this tipping point, then it quickly pulls off to where everyone is connected. Graphs admit to these emergent properties, and emergent properties that are all this activity at the local level is exactly the same, or very close to the same. The difference from behaviors from an average of 1.6 to 1.7 here, 1.8, the vast majority of individuals are doing the exact same thing. Our psychology hasn't changed, our behavior hasn't changed, but a slight shift in the population level, right, creates the difference between no one's at risk to a disease and everyone's at risk to a disease. If we change the shape of that degree distribution to where we have a long tail, a few people who are really active and most people are not, then you still get a phase transition, but it's at a different spot, and the steepness of the transition is different. And so you have a different system-level property based on these underlying demographic features. So again, what do we do then? So that now talks about reachability or connectivity. Where do we go with what flavors of connectivity we have? And the way we typically think about that is something like distance. And so distance is the number of hops it takes me to reach someone else. So here node A is 1 step from 4, 2 steps, 3 steps, 4 steps, 5 steps. So the maximum distance from A to everyone else is 5, and they reach everyone else usually in about 2 or 3. Distance can also be directed. I'm not going to go over that. As a graph statistic, the distribution of distances tells you a good deal about how close people are to each other. It's the foundation of this thing called closeness centrality, and the diameter of the graph is the longest distance. The main thing to keep in mind as we move forward for the week is that most of our distances that we talk about are what are known as geodesic distances. It's that the fastest path I can get to you. If you ever played the Kevin Bacon game or 6 degrees of separation or something like that, that's the idea. Social behavior might not be working on geodesic distances, right? We're probably working on random walk distances or other kinds of multiple flow distances. And so there are other flavors of distances that we can think about. Computationally, it turns out that geodesics are fast to compute because you can do a breadth first search, and so we typically do that. But just to know there are other flavors. The other thing about distance is at least one path of this length. It's the minimum of at least one path. But for things like information and disease flow, we often care about having multiple paths, or what we would call structural cohesion or structural connectivity. And this is the idea that it's not just that there's one path that connects a node to the next, but there are multiple paths. I like this idea to capture this of this thing called node connectivity. And node connectivity says that the path system is characterized by the number of nodes you would have to remove to disconnect the system. And so you can imagine here, in this particular little set of sample graphs, On the left, you have two separate components, so the number of nodes you need to remove to separate the graph into more than one component is 0, because it's already there. But as you move up, you have one node here, which is a cut node. You have two nodes here, which are a 2-cut or a 3-cut. And what's beautiful about the node connectivity idea is that it has a dual. There's a duality of node connectivity, which is the same number, which is the number of nodes to be removed, is also the number of node-independent paths connecting all pairs in that set. So this is beautiful if you care about the spread of something on the networks, because what it means is that there are completely independent routes that you can get from a source to a sink throughout this set. And so if everyone in this set uses a condom, it doesn't matter, because the disease could go through this other site where they don't. And so node connectivity has this nice duality for diffusion purposes between the number of nodes and the number of unique ways to move through the set. It also has some interesting things about nestedness that I'll talk about next week. Not next week, Friday. It's going to feel like a week, but it's not going to be quite that long. All right, I'm almost done, honestly. Because I'm going to do just the world's fastest centrality set. Centrality is how important a node is in the network. There are lots of different types of centrality. I'm not going to talk about most of them. So centrality really is, are you at the periphery of the edge? And the different dimensions you can be at the periphery of the edge are myriad. And these different dimensions are things that are usually context specific. And so there's lots of different ways you can think about, so there's the edge betweenness, for example, in this case, or the lobby index. The point is that people have taken the combination of all these elements I've just talked about, of paths, of triads, of contexts, of values, and they've combined them in some way to say that nodes have either a lot of those or a few of those. And that's a measure of importance, and there are lots of them in networks. The ones we typically care about are degree, which we've already talked about a minute ago, closeness, which is the shortest number of hops I need to get to someone else, which is a radius, if I just yell, how many people hear me. Betweenness, which is my ability to separate others. So am I uniquely a cut node between you and someone else, or have the potential to do that? And a sort of a hodgepodge of all of it, which sounds ugly, but in fact is incredibly useful, which is known as eigenvector centrality, which says, am I central not just because I'm in the middle of the graph, but because I'm connected to other people who are also in the middle of the graph. So am I popular amongst academics? Or am I popular among people who really matter? Right? So that's the difference between eigenvector centrality. All of us, I won't impugn you, but if you're like me, nerds live long. Like being king of the nerds is having high in degree, right? But being a jock is having high eigenvector centrality, right? So that's the difference here. Is it popular versus not? All right. As is usually the case, be sure you know what iGraph is doing when you calculate centrality measures. Centrality measures are probably the most used sort of metric in network analysis. And if you go to iGraph and say, I want closeness centrality of my nodes, you might be tempted to say, here's my beautiful weighted graph where I asked everyone how much they loved each other. I feed that to iGraph centrality, and I ask it for it. And it's going to treat your values as distances. It's going to say people who love each other a lot are further away from each other than people who love each other a little. That's probably not what you want. You probably want to invert those and say that people who love each other a lot are close to each other. And so you should count that tie as shorter than a tie that's out. So anytime that iGraph has to calculate a distance, you need to invert the matrix first. And you might not, again, iGraph will do it for you. It won't give you a warning. It won't give you a notice. It'll just give you a number. And you'll write this beautiful paper that says, in my network, which is different from every other network on the planet, my closeness centrality is inversely correlated with degree centrality and eigenvector centrality. Isn't that interesting? You're going to have a great, beautiful theory, and you're going to talk about it, and then someone's going to come up and say, you should have just inverted your distances, you have an error. Don't let that happen to you. That sucks. That's a bad day. All right. The last sort of set of metrics are a series of networks that combine our edge features with our rest of our network. These fall under the rubric of homophily, and they all have to do with essentially counts of this under the hood of this thing called a mixing matrix. And since I'm already over time, and I think who's after me? Tom? Ashton, I'm stealing your time. I'm almost done. What's that? I thought I had to 10:30. I have 15 minutes? You know how much I can do in 15 minutes? Wow. All right. No, I am almost done. You should never tell me I have more time. That's the first rule of my undergraduates know better than that. All right, so the basic idea is that, especially in social networks and health, we don't care about networks because of networks per se. Many of us in the room might because you're nerds like me, but from a social networks and health standpoint, we care about networks because the pattern of ties intersects with a health status of some sort, either getting a disease or having a condition or engaging in a practice that promotes disease. And so we want to understand how the node set interacts with the attribute set. And the classic way of doing that is this notion of homophily. And homophily is, do birds of a feather fit together? And this is the now most cited paper in sociology. You're close to it, Lynn. One of the authors is in the back of the room. And so the idea here is that we see this happening all the time, right? We see this, like example I showed you at the front of the class. The 7th graders are with each other, and high schoolers with each other, white students with black students. And the question is, how do we measure it, and what does it mean? And so the way we measure it is the simple part. What does it mean turns out to be really complicated because people have lots of ways of getting together, which we're going to go through in different bits today. But the way we measure it is usually having either some version of a mixing matrix or a very fine-grained mixing matrix, which would be a distance matrix again. But the idea is that we have categories like grades in class, and we can count the number of ties that go within grade versus between grade. And so here, the diagonal really matters. What we really want to know is the weight of the diagonal relative to the off diagonal. This, for those of you in the sort of classic social science tradition, this is a contingency table. So if you've ever done log linear models or other kinds of contingency table analyses like mobility tables, this is where or demographic aging tables. These things are all the same sort of idea. So each row is the same category as the column. And so we have 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders in this very small rural school. And so here we see the number of each. So how do we measure this? Well, the simple thing to do is to take the ratio of the diagonal to everything else. That's the proportion of in-group ties. We can be a little more complicated of this. And so there's the external-internal index, or the EI index, which is the number of things off the diagonal minus the things that are on the diagonal divided by all of them. And so this gives you essentially the excess of external ties. A formalization of this, which is a little bit different than the last one you just saw, which is to say let's account for chance in the network. And so we can, if you've ever done a chi-square table, we can take the expected value, the expected number of external ties. We can subtract from that the number of observed ties. Because the expected value builds in the diagonal, you don't have to have them both here directly, you can just do it with the external ties, and divided by the expected. So that gives you something like a t-statistic. It gives you or a chi-square statistic, the number of ties above chance, or the proportion of ties above chance. The problem with all those measures, and this should not be a mystery to people who have ever dealt with mobility tables or marginal effects, is that two-dimensional tables are so much more complicated than we think they are because there's necessary elements due to pure math, right? The number of ties going out have to sum to the number of ties going in, and those constraints on each other mean that a random noise on one dimension equals random noise on the other dimension, and that random noise can make you think you know something you don't know. And so you need to find a way to sort of flesh that out. And one version of that, again, is the segregation index, but it's not what's called marginal free. If I increase the number of blacks in a school, that's going to change the segregation index without changing the underlying association between race and being tied. And so there are corrections to that. The standard one that we've used in medicine and sociology is the odds ratio. You might have also used the risk ratio if you're in sort of hospital or clinical trial studies. But the idea of an odds ratio, it says how likely am I to see something relative to something else? Or how much does it increase the odds? And so if 1 is the even odds. If it's 2, it means it doubles the odds. I grew up with odds ratios and even log odds. I love them. I think they're great. I bent my mind into reasonably thinking about them. If you've played with them a lot, you know that you need to be sensitive to the underlying distribution. So doubling the odds of a really rare event is different than doubling the odds of a really common event. And so odds ratios have tended to fall out of favor recently. So especially in those of you that dealt with logistic analysis and other sorts of modeling in a set, and people are interested in changes in probability known as marginal effects. And so you've gone back to sort of the interpretation of odds ratios away from that. That's fine. The key is to keep in mind that whatever you're doing, that you're correcting for chance and you're finding something that's not contingent on the size of your categories. Right? And so I actually love marginal effects. I like because they admit to a certain kind of visual representation of the predicted probabilities that is just infinitely more intuitive, but still you want to keep in mind in that. In social network analysis, because we got sort of invaded by the physicists a few years ago, we've kind of sort of done this, we've gone a different direction. We haven't gone a marginal effects direction, we've gone towards this critter called modularity, which is not a measure that is intuitive initially, but ends up being quite useful. So the modularity index is a chi-square index, or it's very similar to it, but it's just normalized in a slightly different way. And the way it works, just to give you the intuition again, is that these are your ties, so these are your observed ties, these are your expected ties. So that's your difference from random. We've seen that. That's exactly what the segregation index we saw before. But we're only going to count it if the two nodes are in the same category, and then we're going to normalize it by something else. So that's all this formula is. It's a difference from random. Random is calculated in a really clever way, and we only categorize it, we only count up this value if the two nodes are in the same category. And so it's another way of parameterizing this notion of difference from random ties, but it has some useful properties, particularly for finding groups in a network. When you don't know, like if this is not race or grade or sex or something that's given by God and nature, but what you as an analyst are trying to find, then I can say, well, this node is in group J, this group, and I can adjust this over and over and over again really quickly, get a change in this, and figure out when this gets maximized. And it doesn't crap out at one group or two groups, like segregation index does, and so it's useful for lots of different features in that. All right. Are we still breathing? Questions, comments? See, I'm even 5 minutes early. All right. That is a serious question, though. That was the world's. I know. I told you. Allison's laughing at me. You know this was honestly fast, right? And the goal was to be this was assumed knowledge to some degree. This is to bring us up to where we're at. But questions, thoughts, comments, concerns? All right. Today is only possible, like I said, to a lot of people around the room. So Madeline and Gabe, we already said hello to this morning, but give them another round of applause. They're here all day. If you, does everyone know Gabe? Have you seen Gabe? If you need problems, say hello to Gabe too as well. So Madeline and Gabe are here to help, and we really appreciate it. DNAC and Dana, Tom, and Leanne are here as well, right? So these are DNAC alums that are still around us. Vernon Fisher and Linda Simpson from Dupree are the Duke Population Research Institute. I can never remember if the I is institute or not. Is our POP Center, and they've been very helpful, particularly for those of you that are traveling on our dime. We owe you funds and reimbursements. They're the ones doing all that work behind the scenes, and it's a bucket load of work. So A, we thank them, and B, get me your receipts before you leave, right? Or as soon after you leave as you can, because we have to let them get that work done. All right. Finally, we are in the Rhodes IID space. We are guests here. Kathy Peterson is the person who runs everything and keeps this floor working. She will help us, and she is a kind person and will help us whenever we need it, but we need to return the favor. So be cognizant of our neighbors and all of that. And otherwise, we'll take a quick break, and then Ashton's up. Grab some more coffee if you want. We'll be right back.